Hi, everybody. I'm Lexi Laban, the Executive Director of the Jewish Film Institute, and I'm here today with Oren Jacoby, the Director of On Broadway. Hi, Oren. Good to see you.
Hi, Lexi. Hi, everybody in San Francisco and the area out there.
Thank you so much for joining me for this Q&A. First of all, I just want to thank you so much for sharing your film On Broadway with us. It was amazing to be able to show it at a drive-in movie theater outside under the stars with everybody in community together, physically distant but socially connected. And we wanted to really make this Q&A available to people online since we weren't able to have that opportunity outside under the stars.
I can't imagine a more exciting way to have a West Coast premiere for this film than in two drive-in theaters in California. I mean, if there wasn't COVID, that would be so much fun. I guess the only drag is that because of COVID, I'm not there or I would not have missed it. But thank you for making it possible. And thanks everyone at the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival for all their work.
Yeah, and you look like you're in a wonderful setting for our conversation.
Well, I've been in New York through the first 4 months of COVID and, was very happy to be in my home and it was exciting. But my wife and I decided for a little while we would escape. We were offered a sort of little escape launch pad here for a few weeks. And so we're taking advantage before we go back to the city.
Well, it's really wonderful. I wanted to kick off and ask you a little bit about how this film came about. I'm also particularly interested in your relationship to the material. Are you a Broadway fanatic?
I would not say a fanatic. I'm a theater fanatic. As well as being a documentary filmmaker, I've worked in the theater. I went to drama school to study directing and worked in the regional theater for a while. And I've done off-Broadway, off-Broadway plays in New York. And in recent years did a adaptation of a famous American novel that was produced around the country in several regional theaters, which may someday make it to Broadway. But otherwise, I'm a fan of a lot of what Broadway does, and through this film have learned to love everything that Broadway does because of what it does for New York City and because of how many people appreciate all the different kinds of things you can get on Broadway. I think I was kind of a snob before. I sort of aimed for a certain kind of play or certain actors or certain writers. And I've discovered that the fabulous thing is that everybody can find something that they love on Broadway. And that really what makes it special is its diversity, and it's really reflecting America in so many ways. And hopefully they're going to figure out a way on Broadway to make it affordable so everybody can come and see it too. I mean, it's a lot better than it used to with half-price ticket offers everywhere. But I think they're going to figure out more ways to make it appealing to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting coming from theater and then making a film about Broadway. I mean, there's so much in your film that really looks at the relationship between nonprofit and, like Yale Repertory Theater, and how those productions that are developed in these other areas actually make it to Broadway. So was that part of your idea for the
It reflects a
film?
little of my bias. Yeah, I studied at the Yale Drama School, so the Yale Repertory Theater was my home as a theater person for, the beginning of my career. And I was lucky enough because I was in New Haven at the drama school. My first week of drama school, I met August Wilson, who came to Yale with a suitcase full of plays. And we happened to have a connection. And so we got to talking and I found that he was, so open to talking to students and encouraging to young people working in the theater. And then I got to be at the drama school for the next 3 years while all of his first amazing works came to life. And we got to sit in on the rehearsal room. I got to watch James Earl Jones and Mary Alice doing Fences and Charles Dutton and Angela Bassett working on the plays they were in. And it was a very exciting experience to be at the Yale Drama School in those years. Also, Athol Fugard, the great South African playwright, was working there. And that was one of the reasons I'd been drawn there, because it was really seeing his plays that made me want to work in the theater. I'd already been a documentary filmmaker, and he was a documentary filmmaker as well as a playwright. And his work had a kind of documentary aspect to it. that you took things in real life and you can turn it into something that's artistic and something that speaks to a wide audience. And so that was very exciting to me. And I got to work with him on 4 plays while I was there. So it was a great, great experience for me.
Yeah, you can really feel that connection running through your film. Were those connections that you made early on pivotal in, you know, the making of this film? Who were your collaborators and who?
It's a very, very different approach of how this film happened. Excuse me for interrupting.
It's okay, go ahead.
A very New York story, a very Jewish Upper West Side story. I was at a New Year's party brunch that my wife and I go to every year with friends, and it's a wonderful party with people from all kinds of journalists and artists and writers and all kinds of people. And at the party, a mutual friend introduced me to Pat Schoenfeld, who at the time was an 89-year-old, she's now 91 years old, widow of Jerry Schoenfeld, who ran the Schubert Organization for many years. And she wanted to tell me about the book that she'd gotten published. It was Jerry's memoir that she published posthumously, that she got a writer to help polish, and she found publishers and agents and got the book out. And she thought it would make a great documentary. And I read the book, and then she gave me another book that was about the same subject by Michael Riedel, the New York Daily News theater critic and feature writer. And they really told the same story. And it was a story, even though I'm a New Yorker, lived there all my whole life, even though I'm a theater lover and worked in the theater, I never really understood the core story of Broadway in my lifetime, which these 2 books told about, which was really how Broadway almost went out of business in 1970, early 1970s. The audience had gone, the theater was kind of deflated in a lot of ways, and the neighborhood was so scary, the times were so bad in New York City that people were scared to come to the theater at night. As you see in the film, cops literally handed out flyers warning people and telling them to go home by sundown, which is not good for the theater business. So I got talking to Pat. She suggested I read the books. The next thing she said, I can raise the money to make this movie. As a filmmaker, those are the magic words. When you hear that,
Dream.
and it's a good story, and it's something that you love and you're interested in anyway, it's impossible to resist. Another totally different theater story. After I graduated from the Yale Drama School, I was lucky enough to meet Jerzy Grotowski, the great Polish avant-garde director that was featured in the Louis Malle film, My Dinner with Andre. And here was the great guru of modern theater. And I was there as sort of struggling young director trying to figure out what to do next. And I said to him, how do you choose your direction? How do you know what to do next? And what would you encourage a young director to go to find his way? And he said, you're kidding yourself if you think you're making choices. We all say, oh, I choose this or I choose that. We don't really choose anything. What we do is we succumb to temptation. And it's like, what you do is you give in to the best temptation, the one that's going to long run bring you the most happiness. And so really that's been my filmmaking career. And with this film, like many others, I succumbed to the temptation of the story of Broadway in New York and an incredible supporter in Pat Schoenfeld, who knew people she could go out and both help raise money, but more importantly, because of the relationship she had built over 50 years with people in the theater business, was able to open doors for us and get many of her friends who she'd stayed connected with, people like Helen Mirren and Ian McKellen and Hugh Jackman, to come and do interviews with us for the film. So she was an extraordinary partner for this project and fun to work with. And as I say, she's now 91 and probably the most energetic, vibrant person I've ever worked with.
Wow, that's terrific. Let's talk a little bit about the Schuberts, the Schoenfelds, the Jacobs, Michael Eisner. There were so many Jewish, both business people and the creatives, Sondheim and others who were involved in Broadway. And a lot of them were immigrants that came to this country. What can you say about their identities and how that connected to their dream for this industry?
Well, I think the theater, like other parts of show business and certain other industries, were among the few areas of American public life and business that were open to Jews in the early days of those early immigrants. Um, uh, I'm the grandson of immigrants, and my father was first generation. He worked in the theater first. His first job was he worked as a producer on Broadway. Then he ended up going into film. Um, that was one of the professions that was open to people. Um, and the fact that the Schubert brothers, who were immigrants from Russia or Eastern Europe, who came to upstate New York and then moved to New York in their 20s, who started the really created Broadway as the venue for theater in New York. They built an empire that was, most of their colleagues, many of the people in the business were Jewish. As you say, many of the great directors and artists were Jewish, and actors, and it was a place where Jews could thrive. As time has passed, one of the great things about Broadway and the story we tell in the film is that Broadway is really open to reflecting how the American society changes, and also is always understands that it needs to reflect the diversity of America and show what's going on in our society. I mean, sometimes it has lagged behind and then it's gotten a kick and it's jumped forward. Sometimes it's ahead of the curve, sometimes it's behind the curve, but somehow it reflects where we are. And as, you know, in the period covered in our film, I think you could say that maybe Broadway has become a little less Jewish, in terms that it's been open to other people and reflects other kinds of stories and other kinds of artists. But it still is a place where Jews are well represented, and where I think the sort of open-mindedness and liberality of Jews has been a big part of Broadway diversity through the years.
Yeah. I mean, your film is really interesting because, I spent my childhood going to Broadway shows, and then through college went, in on 2 for tickets or $10, sit in the back nosebleed heaven tickets, but saw many of the wonderful shows that are represented in the movie. And I never really learned about the full history either of Broadway. And I think my grandmother did take me in the 70s to see Broadway matinees of some of those earlier shows that you have represented in the film. So the structure of the film, you have a chronology, but you're also really bringing forward a lot of themes about commercialism versus culture. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you structured the film. Was that coming from the book, or did that come later in the edit? How did you think of the journey that you wanted to take us on?
Well, when I read the 2 books, they had fabulous stories, but neither one really had a kind of coherent arc of what is the main experience that we want here. And so I kind of, as you said, pulled out a couple of themes that I thought were really important. And the first theme that I felt, well, look, this is really a story. If I was, making a film about the theater that I love, it would be certain, as we talked about earlier, more esoteric things that came from the regional theater, things that were a little more avant-garde, things that were more classical. I love old Broadway musicals. I love, old Broadway classics like The Front Page, which has been done in several revivals in recent years. But that I really wanted to reflect what had made Broadway a success and what had enabled it to save New York City, which it really did. I mean, that's the story. That's the core story we're telling, is this business that almost went bankrupt. They were literally talking about possibly bulldozing down the theaters and turning them into parking lots, was something that the Attorney General of New York proposed when there was a scandal that involved the Schuberts and some of the ways they were doing business before Jerry Schoenfeld and Bernie Jacobs took over. And so I knew it had to be a business story on some level, but I also wanted it to be a story about the art that is what makes Broadway important to people and why they care about it, and the shows that people love. And so we decided to pick, I often think when I'm making a film, what are the pillars that are going to hold up the structure of the film? And the pillars were these 10 or so shows that we decided had been the turning points that had really changed the direction of Broadway. After these shows happened, things were done differently. They broke new ground. They did something that had never been done before. And the shock to me, the sort of researching the film and coming up with this arc, was that I had always thought, oh, well, what makes it on Broadway is the commercial stuff. the stuff that you know is going to be a hit, the stuff that is the, oh yeah, we'll do one of those and that'll make us money. And in fact, the opposite was true. All of the biggest successes that were in the 50 years we covered were shows that were completely out of, you know, the ordinary, that artists took huge risks, and the producers who backed them and put their shows on Broadway took even bigger risks because they had to put a lot of money into them.
Yeah, I mean, these are the T.S. Eliot, inspired Cats and Chorus Line and Rent and Hamilton.
If you did the elevator pitch for any of these shows, nobody in their right mind, certainly in Hollywood, would ever have bankrolled them. You know,
Yeah.
a story about cats written by an English poet, an American English poet, and no one would do it.
Yeah.
But those are the things that the artists connected with something that was happening at that moment in our society and knew what it was. And playwrights, the composers, the directors, the designers, they put together these masterful works, because that's the other thing about the shows that we cover. They're all, the technique of theater making at its highest. And
Yeah.
that's in the craft, in the acting, in the writing, in the music. It really, I already had respect for the craft, but making this film made me respect it even more.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to talk about is this issue that you brought up earlier about diversity and about Broadway really reflecting the American experience, really holding a mirror up to us and reflecting back at us, who are we as a people? And you chose this developing play, The Nap, to be kind of a through thread within this structure that you've created. And I'm curious about how you decided on that. And then, the role that Alexandra Billings plays is really great in the film because, she talks about the fact that here she is a transgendered actress, but the part isn't solely focused on that part of her identity. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about diversity, casting as it relates to, the questions of diversity. And are we heading in that direction, or are we, where are we going in the future?
Well, first question of how we picked that play. It was important to us when we started doing the film. The big story that we were hearing in the interviews when we started talking to people was the danger is that the straight play, as opposed to the musical, the play that's written by a playwright without music and his dialogue, which the old name was the straight play, which is to differentiate it from a musical. Didn't mean that it was about straight characters or written by a straight person. It just meant it was just a play, not a musical. The stories we were hearing from people were that this kind of theater was dying out on Broadway, that it was just too dangerous to risk the amount of money and to make the commitment for these kinds of plays, which don't run for very long. They have a smaller audience, and more of the Broadway audience these days are tourists, many of whom don't speak English. And so they're much more likely to go to a musical show where they don't have to understand the dialogue, but they're crapped up and they're excited by the music and the stagecraft and the spectacle. And we were hearing that it's hard for people who want to produce a play as opposed to a musical to find a theater. It's harder for them to find investors, and fewer of the rare slots that open up, because the more there are big long-running successes like Cats and Phantom of the Opera and Hamilton and Lion King, the harder it is for new plays to find a spot. And there are now 43 theaters on Broadway. There were 41 when we started the film. There are now 43 because the British Ambassador Theater Group have opened 2 new theaters, the one where Harry Potter is playing and a smaller theater called the Hudson, where American Utopia, the David Byrne musical, was playing when Broadway shut down, or was about to return to when Broadway shut down. So it's hard to find a slot. Someone described it to us, it's like airplanes circling the runway and you have to wait till there's an opening and then you jump down and grab it. So we thought there would be fewer and fewer plays, and that it was important in telling the story of the film to represent that this has been an important part of Broadway's history and it's in danger, so we ought to look at one. And I also thought, well, how exciting to look at one that's kind of crazy, that is not a commercial idea at all. I mean, it's about the sport of snooker, the British sport of snooker, which nobody in America knows anything about or really even understands. And it has a transgender lead character. And it never even, I mean, most English plays that come to Broadway were hits in the West End of London. This play never even made it to London because there's specific demands of presenting it that didn't fit any of the London stages. So it was really a risk at the Manhattan Theater Club, one of the nonprofit theaters that function on Broadway, took on this play. And I wanted to show, look, crazy things get done on Broadway. People who take risks, that's always been the lowest common, the real, thing that shows the exciting work on Broadway is work that's being done where you're taking a risk. And we were very lucky that the play we picked had a transgender character, that they cast a fabulous transgender actress in Alexandra Billings, who was wonderful to talk to and interview, and who's fabulous in the play. And the play turned out to be a hit. I mean, it was a nonprofit theater. It didn't have an extended run because it wasn't planned to, but it did fairly well, and the critics loved it. I mean, the Times gave it a rave. So it was a lucky kind of payoff that happened. In terms of casting, I mean, there's been quite an outcry in the last, month or so as the Black Lives Matter movement has returned and become such a concern for everyone around the country, that Broadway needs to do more. And that's something that we talk about in the film. Even before that had all happened, we have several people saying, look, Broadway's done a lot, and Hamilton obviously broke open all new possibilities and showed how successful plays that reached out to people of, all diversity, all races, all ages, and that Broadway needs to do this. But that it's still not, not representative of most of what's on Broadway. But certain things have happened in the period that we show in the film that are extraordinary. One is that you can't go to a Broadway musical now and not have a diverse cast. Even if they're doing a revival of Carousel, which takes place, and the chorus of dancers and singers are supposed to be fishermen in New England in the 1920s or whenever it takes place, they have African Americans and Latinos in the cast, and one of the leads was Latino, and they just have made the decision that Broadway is going to be what they call colorblind casting. And that means you can cast anybody of any race in any role from any time period. And also now with I think this latest initiative, we're going to see more plays that are about the actual experiences of the different diverse communities. That it's not just going to be limited to the ones that have been shown already, but that we're going to get windows onto other worlds and see more plays by African-American men, African-American women, Latino men and women, and all other groups.
Well, I think it's a really exciting time. I, need to wrap up with a question that I think is on everyone's minds right now, which is that, we're living in this time period of a global pandemic. It isn't the first time that Broadway and all of us have faced a health epidemic that has had, tremendous repercussions on the theater industry. The AIDS epidemic really is covered extensively in your film and had a huge impact on the theater community. And now we're living with the coronavirus that also had a huge impact on New York. And I couldn't help in watching the film that, I experienced great joy, but also real emotional sadness because Broadway is currently dark and the industry faces a lot of challenges in the future. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this pause that we're all in right now could come back to positively impact the future direction of Broadway. And what are you seeing among the people that you're talking to about how they're hoping that Broadway will come back?
Well, we did a short prologue kind of film that's going to be shown at your film festival about what's happening on Broadway in these months of COVID. And we did ask that very question of a lot of the people we interviewed, and it was really interesting what they talked about. I mean, one thing is, I was very surprised. David Henry Wong, who's the wonderful playwright and creator of musicals, who's now been recently the head of the Broadway League, the chairman of the Broadway League. He talked about the importance of when Broadway comes back, of finding ways to have cheaper tickets so that more kinds of people can come to plays. And I think, it's a responsibility of Broadway, but I think it's also something that audiences have to think about when we come back. I think people really, the idea of live entertainment is really at risk in our world. I think as important as it is to people, we've become so attuned to looking at screens that even though there's a real hunger that, people, because they spend so much time looking at their computers or their phones, there's a hunger to get out and have the live experience. We're just not, young people, and a lot of us are not programmed in the same way to go to the theater to see a movie, to go to see a play, to go to hear a live music performance. And I'm really hopeful that people, because we're denied of some of this experience while we're here, I hope we don't just get lazy and get used to doing it all here on the computer and stop thinking about going out and saving enough of our money to make it a special occasion or whatever it is to get to the theater, to get to New York and see a play, go to your regional theater and see a play. Whatever's going on in your town, if they're putting on plays, encourage live performers to keep doing what they do, because we really can't live full lives without them. And I'm hopeful that this sort of, as you say, this rest period will make us more hungry instead of less inclined to come back and go see Broadway shows and go see other kinds of live performances.
Yeah, well, I know I'll be there as soon as they're open and ready for business. So thank you so much, Oren, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I wish you all the best with this film, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Have a great festival, and thanks again, Lexi.
Okay.
Thanks for going on Broadway. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.